June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 15,000 feet above Task Force 58. 10:47 hours. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp engine filled Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu's cockpit as he spotted them, a formation of Japanese aircraft climbing toward the American carrier fleet like an offering to slaughter. Through the frameless canopy of his F6F Hellcat, the Pacific sun glinted off enemy wings with an almost ceremonial clarity, each reflection marking another target in what naval aviators would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal permeated the cramped space, mixing with the sharp tang of adrenaline as Vrasiu's gloved hand tightened on the control stick, his 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. The sound that defined this moment was not the engine's thunder or the whistle of wind through gun ports, but rather the steady electronic pulse of the radar altimeter, a rhythmic reminder that American technology had given these pilots advantages the Japanese could not match, that the tide of the Pacific War had turned irreversibly, and that the aircraft Vrasiu flew represented the culmination of American industrial might translated into aerial dominance. The Hellcat had been born from desperation and transformed into supremacy. When Japanese Zeros had torn through American aircraft at Pearl Harbor and in the war's opening months, the United States Navy faced a crisis of capability. Their F4F Wildcats were outmatched, their pilots were learning through blood, and their carrier doctrine was being rewritten with each engagement. The Zero had seemed invincible in those dark months, lighter, more maneuverable, blessed with extraordinary range and flown by pilots who had perfected their craft over China and in countless training hours. American aviators who survived encounters with Japanese fighters spoke in hushed tones about the Zero's ability to outclimb, outturn, and simply outlast American aircraft in aerial combat. The psychological weight of facing such an opponent had pressed down on every American pilot who strapped into a cockpit in 1942, knowing that their machines were inferior and that survival depended more on tactics and luck than on the capabilities of the aircraft itself. The Grumman F6F Hellcat changed that equation entirely. Developed with brutal lessons learned from early war combat, the Hellcat embodied a philosophy that would define American military success: overwhelming power, robust construction, and design focused not on elegance but on winning. Grumman's engineers had studied combat reports with obsessive detail, every Zero kill, every American loss, every tactical evolution that kept pilots alive. They learned that American pilots had discovered the Zero's weaknesses. It couldn't dive with American aircraft. Its lightweight construction made it vulnerable to damage, and its lack of armor meant that American 50 caliber rounds would tear it apart if they connected. The Hellcat was designed to exploit every one of these vulnerabilities while negating every Japanese advantage. With a 2,000 horsepower engine producing more than double the Zero's output, the Hellcat could outrun, outdive, and, when needed, simply muscle through maneuvers that would tear a lighter aircraft apart. The 650 caliber Brownings delivered a weight of fire that could destroy an enemy aircraft in a 2-second burst, and the Hellcat's armor protected its pilot from the rear, ensuring that American aviators would come home even when they couldn't avoid being hit. Japanese pilots who encountered Hellcats for the first time expected to face improved Wildcats, tougher perhaps, but still bound by the limitations that had made American aircraft vulnerable in the war's early phases. What they found instead was something that violated their understanding of aerial combat. The Hellcat didn't try to turn with them, it didn't need to. American pilots had been trained in tactics that played to their aircraft's strengths: high-speed slashing attacks, boom and zoom maneuvers that used superior power, and dive speed to dictate the terms of engagement. When a Japanese pilot tried to lure a Hellcat into a turning fight where the Zero's superior maneuverability might matter, the American pilot simply dove away, using his aircraft's superior speed to disengage, climb back to altitude, and set up another attack run. The psychological impact of this tactical reality was devastating for Japanese aviators who had been trained to believe that their aircraft's agility and their own skill would always prevail. They found themselves unable to force the combat they had trained for, unable to exploit their advantages, and increasingly unable to survive encounters with an aircraft that seemed designed specifically to counter everything the Zero had once represented. The sound of the Hellcat's guns became a symbol of American industrial supremacy, not the single weapon sound of a pilot's individual skill, but the collective thunder of 6 heavy machine guns firing in unison, each weapon belt-fed and synchronized, each capable of sustaining fire that would overheat lesser weapons, each delivering rounds that had been manufactured by the millions in factories that Japanese strategic planners had catastrophically underestimated. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was itself a masterpiece of American engineering, reliable, powerful, and produced in such quantities that equipping 6 per fighter was considered standard rather than excessive. When Vratziu pressed his trigger and all 6 guns opened fire, the Hellcat shuddered with recoil, and the air filled with tracers that looked like red threads being pulled toward the target. The sound inside the cockpit was overwhelming, a staccato roar that drowned out even the engine, a mechanical thunder that represented not just firepower, but the entire industrial apparatus that had made such firepower routine rather than exceptional. The numbers tell a story of dominance so complete it borders on the absurd. F6F Hellcats destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat while losing only 270 Hellcats to enemy fighters, a kill ratio of 19:1 that represented not just tactical superiority but a fundamental transformation in the Pacific War's balance of power. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which included the engagement where Vratziu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single 8-minute span, American Hellcats and other fighters destroyed approximately 600 Japanese aircraft over 2 days while losing fewer than 30 in air combat. The battle was so one-sided that American pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a piece of gallows humor that captured both the lopsided nature of the combat and the grim satisfaction of finally possessing aircraft that made them hunters rather than prey. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from these losses, not just the aircraft, which could theoretically be replaced, but the pilots who represented years of training and combat experience that Japan's truncated training pipeline could not replicate. The Hellcat's design reflected American military philosophy in ways that extended beyond mere specifications. The aircraft was rugged to a fault. Pilots reported bringing Hellcats home with damage that would have downed any other fighter. The wide-track landing gear made carrier operations dramatically safer than the narrow-geared Zero, which had a tendency to ground loop on carriers and killed many Japanese pilots in landing accidents. The Hellcat's cockpit was spacious by contemporary standards, reducing pilot fatigue during long missions and providing better visibility than the confined spaces of Axis fighters. Perhaps most importantly, the Hellcat was designed to be maintained by average mechanics working in difficult conditions. It didn't require the precision maintenance that kept so many German and Japanese aircraft grounded for repairs. This focus on practical reliability over theoretical excellence represented a distinctly American approach to war, building weapons that could be operated by typical soldiers, maintained under combat conditions, and produced in quantities that made individual losses acceptable rather than catastrophic. Lieutenant Vratziu's experience on June 19, 1944, exemplified how individual skill combined with superior equipment to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. Vratziu was one of the Navy's top aces, a pilot whose talent and training made him exceptional even among carrier aviators. But his 6 kills that day were possible only because his Hellcat gave him advantages that allowed his skill to manifest. the power to choose when and how to engage, the protection to survive when he couldn't avoid danger, and the firepower to convert opportunities into kills without requiring perfect shot placement. Japanese pilots that day were often veterans themselves, men who had survived years of combat, who flew their Zeros with the skill born of desperation and experience. But skill without adequate tools is courage wasted, and by mid-1944, Japanese aviators were being sent into combat in aircraft that were increasingly obsolete, with inadequate armor, with engines that couldn't match American power, and with the knowledge that each mission might be their last, because the odds were no longer remotely fair. The transformation in Pacific carrier aviation between 1942 and 1944 can be measured in the confidence of American air crews. In the early war, American pilots flew with the knowledge that their aircraft were inferior, that each combat was a test they might fail through no fault of their own. By the time Hellcats dominated the skies over the Philippine Sea, American pilots flew with the assurance that their aircraft gave them every possible advantage, that their training had prepared them for the tactics their machines enabled, and that the industrial power behind them meant that losses, both aircraft and pilots, would be replaced while Japanese losses would steadily erode an irreplaceable force. This psychological shift was as important as any technical specification. When pilots believe in their equipment, they fight differently, more aggressively, more confidently, willing to take calculated risks because they know their aircraft will give them the capability to turn those risks into victories. The symbolic significance of the Hellcat sound, that distinctive growl of the R-2800 engine combined with the thunder of 650 calibers, became the acoustic signature of American naval air power. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands learned to recognize that sound, learned to take cover when they heard the Hellcats approach, learned that American fighters overhead meant that Japanese aircraft would not be providing support, that supply convoys would not arrive safely, that their isolation was complete and irreversible. The sound became a promise and a threat. For Americans, it promised air superiority and eventual victory. For Japanese forces, it threatened destruction and confirmed that the war was lost, even if the fighting continued. The psychological impact of air superiority cannot be overstated. When one side owns the sky, the other side fights blind, moves only at night, and gradually understands that every strategic option has been foreclosed. The Hellcats' dominance reshaped Japanese tactical and strategic thinking in ways that reverberated through the war's final year. Japanese commanders, recognizing they could no longer contest American air superiority through conventional means, increasingly turned to desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks that accepted the certain death of pilots in exchange for even a small chance of damaging American ships. The kamikaze represented a confession of failure, an acknowledgement that Japan could no longer train pilots capable of competing with American aviators in American aircraft, that the industrial war had been lost, and that the only remaining option was to trade lives for time in the hope that American will might break before Japanese material resources were completely exhausted. The Hellcats' role in forcing this strategic desperation was direct and measurable. By destroying Japanese naval aviation as an effective force, the Hellcat eliminated Japan's ability to defend its perimeter, to contest American advances, and to inflict losses that might make continued American offense unacceptable. The aircraft became, in effect, a weapon of strategic exhaustion. Each kill ratio, each lopsided engagement, another nail in the coffin of Japanese hopes for negotiated peace. The engineering that made the Hellcat possible reflected American industrial capacity in ways that extended beyond the aircraft itself. The R-2800 engine was a marvel of mechanical engineering, 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows running on high-octane aviation fuel that American petroleum refineries produced in quantities that dwarfed Japanese capacity. The aluminum that formed the Hellcat's airframe came from American bauxite mines and smelters operating at scales that made aircraft production routine rather than precious. The Browning machine guns represented decades of refinement in firearms design, manufactured by companies that understood mass production and quality control at levels that ensured every weapon would function reliably under combat stress. Even the radios, the hydraulics, the electrical systems, every component of the Hellcat represented an industrial base that could produce not just one excellent aircraft, but thousands of excellent aircraft, along with the spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and maintenance infrastructure to keep them operational across the Pacific's vast distances. Grumman produced 12,075 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, an average of more than 300 aircraft per month at peak production. This industrial achievement meant that American carrier air groups could maintain full strength despite losses, that new pilots arriving in the Pacific could train in the same aircraft they would fly in combat, and that tactical innovations could spread rapidly because every squadron flew the same aircraft with the same capabilities. The standardization also simplified logistics. Spare parts for one Hellcat fit every Hellcat. Maintenance crews trained on the aircraft could service any squadron's planes, and tactical lessons learned in one carrier group could be immediately applied across the fleet. This standardization was itself a form of military advantage, representing an institutional maturity and industrial sophistication that Japan's more artisanal approach to aircraft production could not match. The emotional transformation for American aviators who transitioned from Wildcats to Hellcats was profound and immediate. Pilots who had spent months in inferior aircraft, who had developed tactics that emphasized survival over victory, suddenly found themselves flying machines that gave them every advantage. The difference was visceral: more power on takeoff, faster climb rates, better visibility, and above all, the knowledge that the aircraft could absorb punishment and bring them home. This confidence translated into aggressiveness that Japanese pilots increasingly could not match. American fighter tactics evolved from defensive conservatism to offensive dominance, with Hellcat pilots seeking combat rather than avoiding it, confident that their aircraft would give them the tools to win virtually any engagement. The psychological warfare aspect of this shift was significant. Japanese pilots increasingly fought with the knowledge that they were outmatched, that survival depended on avoiding combat rather than seeking it, and that each mission was likely to end in death because the odds were so overwhelmingly against them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the Hellcat's finest hour and simultaneously the death knell of Japanese carrier aviation. Over 2 days in June 1944, American fighters destroyed the majority of Japan's remaining carrier-capable aircraft and pilots in combat, so one-sided that it barely qualified as a battle. The Japanese had launched massive strikes against Task Force 58, expecting that numerical superiority and pilot determination would overwhelm American defenses. Instead, they found Hellcats vectored to intercept by radar-equipped fighter directors, guided to optimal tactical positions, and flown by pilots whose training and equipment made them individually superior to their Japanese counterparts. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Japanese strike packages were torn apart before reaching their targets. Those few Japanese aircraft that survived to attack the American fleet faced dense anti-aircraft fire from ships whose radar-directed guns were dramatically more effective than their pre-war equivalents. The few hits that Japanese pilots achieved were against ships whose damage control capabilities ensured that minor damage would not become catastrophic, another dimension of American industrial superiority. The sound of Vrasiu's guns firing during his 6-kill engagement was recorded in combat footage and has become one of the iconic audio artifacts of the Pacific War. The footage shows tracers converging on Japanese aircraft the targets disintegrating or exploding as 50 caliber rounds tore through their unarmored structures, and the Hellcat pulling away from each kill to immediately acquire the next target. The efficiency of the kills is almost clinical. There is no prolonged maneuvering, no extended exchanges of fire, just the Hellcat positioning, firing, and moving to the next target while the previous one falls in flames. This efficiency was the product of perfect synergy between pilot skill, aircraft capability, and tactical doctrine, each element reinforcing the others to produce results that exceeded what any single component could achieve. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats reported feelings of helplessness and inevitability. In their after-action reports and post-war interviews, they described the psychological impact of facing aircraft they couldn't outrun, couldn't outclimb, and couldn't escape from once engaged. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, which had dominated early war combat, was increasingly irrelevant because American pilots refused to fight on those terms. Japanese aviators found themselves in a tactical trap. If they turned to evade, the Hellcat would extend, climb, and attack again from a position of advantage. If they tried to run, the Hellcat's superior speed would allow it to chase them down, and if they tried to fight, the Hellcat's superior firepower and protection meant that even successful hits on the American fighter often didn't result in kills, while any hit on a Zero was potentially fatal. The tactical initiative had shifted completely and irreversibly to the Americans, and Japanese pilots knew it. The Hellcat's success was not just about aerial combat statistics. It was about the broader role the aircraft played in establishing and maintaining American air superiority across the Pacific. Hellcats flew combat air patrol over amphibious invasions, protecting landing forces from Japanese air attack. They conducted fighter sweeps over Japanese-held islands, destroying aircraft on the ground and suppressing enemy airfields. They escorted strike aircraft attacking Japanese shipping and installations, ensuring that American bombers reached their targets and returned safely. In every role, the Hellcat proved adequate to excellent, not always the absolute best at any single mission, but good enough at all missions that the Navy didn't need specialized aircraft for different tasks. This versatility was itself a form of economy of force, allowing American carriers to maximize their effective combat power without requiring complex air group compositions. The engineering philosophy that produced the Hellcat, robust construction, overwhelming power, heavy armament, and design focused on practical combat effectiveness rather than theoretical performance, became a template for American fighter development that extended beyond World War II. The lessons learned from the Hellcat influenced the design of jets that followed, established doctrines about the importance of pilot protection and aircraft survivability, and validated the American approach to military procurement that emphasized producing very good equipment in large quantities rather than pursuing perfection in smaller numbers. The Hellcat's kill ratio and operational record became benchmarks against which future fighters would be measured, standards that remained relevant through the jet age and into the era of missile-armed fighters. The transformation of the Pacific War between 1942 and 1945 can be symbolized through the evolution from the outmatched Wildcat to the dominant Hellcat. In 1942, American pilots flew inferior aircraft and died learning how to compensate for their machine's weaknesses. By 1944, American pilots flew the best carrier fighter in the world and used it to systematically destroy Japanese air power in combat, so one-sided that it sometimes seemed unfair even to the Americans inflicting the losses. This transformation was not primarily about pilot skill. American pilots in 1942 were brave and increasingly skilled, just as American pilots in 1944 were brave and skilled. The transformation was about giving those pilots aircraft that allowed their skill to matter, that protected them when they made mistakes, that empowered them to take the fight to the enemy rather than merely surviving enemy attacks. The Hellcat was the weapon that made that transformation possible, and in doing so, it became the instrument through which American industrial might was translated into tactical dominance and strategic victory. The sound of the Hellcat's guns, 6 Browning .50 calibers, firing in unison, was the sound of American industrial democracy at war. Each round fired represented American manufacturing capacity, the steel mills that produced the gun barrels, the chemical plants that made the propellant, the brass mills that formed the cartridge cases, the factories that assembled millions of rounds that were shipped across the Pacific to feed weapons that could fire nearly 100 rounds per second when all guns fired together. The sound represented American strategic choices about how to win wars, not through individual heroism alone, though that was necessary, but through giving individual heroes tools that multiplied their effectiveness. The sound represented American confidence that the war would be won through superior material, superior technology, superior logistics, and superior industrial capacity, confidence that was not arrogance because it was based on objective assessment of capabilities and resources. Most fundamentally, the sound represented a promise to American pilots that they would be given every possible advantage, that their lives would be valued enough to protect them with armor and superior aircraft, that the nation would not send them into battle in inadequate machines and expect their courage alone to overcome material deficiencies. The legacy of the F6F Hellcat extends beyond its combat record to represent a moment when American military innovation, industrial capacity, and strategic vision aligned perfectly to produce a weapon system that was exactly what was needed when it was needed. The Hellcat arrived in the Pacific at precisely the moment when the war's momentum was shifting, when American strategy was transitioning from desperate defense to methodical offense, when the vast American industrial machine was reaching full production capacity and beginning to overwhelm Axis forces through sheer material superiority. The aircraft was not perfect. It was heavier and less maneuverable than lighter fighters. Its range was less than the Zeros, and in pure speed it was matched or exceeded by some late-war Axis fighters. But perfection was not required. What was required was an aircraft good enough to consistently defeat the enemy in the conditions where combat actually occurred, tough enough to bring pilots home alive, and producible in quantities that ensured American numerical superiority would be maintained regardless of losses. The Hellcat met all these requirements and in doing so became the weapon that ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective force that enabled American carrier operations that brought the war to Japan's doorstep, that protected amphibious operations that seized the islands from which the final air assault on Japan would be launched, and that ultimately helped make the Allied victory in the Pacific not just possible, but inevitable. As Lieutenant Varatsiou flew back to his carrier after his 6-kill mission, his Hellcat showing only minor damage despite intense combat, he carried with him the knowledge that he had survived not just through skill, but through the quality of his aircraft, through the advantage of having a machine that gave him every possible edge over his opponents. That knowledge was shared by thousands of American naval aviators who flew Hellcats throughout the Pacific War, who trusted their aircraft to bring them home, who attacked with confidence because they knew their machines could deliver on the promise of superior performance. The Hellcat's sound, engine roar, and gun thunder became the last thing many Japanese pilots heard, became the acoustic signature that announced American naval air power was present and dominant, became the sound that marked the transformation of the Pacific from contested space to American domain. That sound echoes through history as a reminder that wars are won not just by brave men, but by brave men given the tools to make their bravery effective, that industrial capacity matters as much as individual courage, that the side which can produce better weapons in greater numbers will ultimately prevail if it has the strategic vision to employ those weapons effectively. The F6F Hellcat was the best carrier fighter of World War II, not because it was perfect, but because it was exactly what American naval aviation needed when they needed it: a robust, powerful, reliable aircraft that could be produced in quantity, flown by average to excellent pilots, and used to establish and maintain air superiority against an enemy who could no longer compete in the industrial war that the Pacific had become. The Hellcat ruled the Pacific because it was the right weapon at the right time, wielded by the right people for the right purpose. And in war, that combination of circumstances is worth more than any amount of theoretical perfection.